Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Entwistle, and I am the co-director of the Newburyport Literary Festival. This is our 17th year of bringing authors and readers together, and it's our third year as a virtual event. So thank you for joining us for this event. I would like to introduce our speakers. So we have the author Nathaniel Ian Miller here with us. He holds an MFA in creative writing and MS in environmental studies from the University of Montana. He's a former resident in the Arctic Circle Expeditionary Program. He's written for Virginia Quarterly Review and for newspapers in Wisconsin, New Mexico, Montana, and Colorado, for which he received multiple Associated Press awards. He lives with his family on a farm in central Vermont. And joining him is author David Arnold. He's the New York Times bestselling author of The Electric Kingdom, Mosquito Land, Kids of Appetite, and The Strange Fascinations of Noah Hypnotic. He has won the Southern Book Prize and the Great Lakes Book Award and was named a Publishers Weekly Flying Start for his debut. He lives in Lexington, Kentucky with his wife and son. So welcome to this event, the Memoirs of Stockholm, Sven. And David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and also to Newburyport Literary Festival. This is a really exciting moment for me, mainly because how often is it that you get to discuss one of your all-time favorite books? And yes, this is an all-time favorite of mine. Discuss that book with the author. Nathaniel and I have hung out virtually and gotten some good discussions in, but I've saved a few questions because I didn't want, it needs to feel like off the cuff, kind of natural. And but I'm going to fanboy for a minute. But before I do that, yes, what Jennifer said, if anybody has questions, just put them in the Q&A down here, and I will save some time at the end to get to those. So Nathaniel, how you doing?
I'm doing well, David. And yourself?
I'm good. I'm so excited to talk to you. I think I told you this when we spoke last time, but the way that I came about this book was, I think it was like an independent bookseller's dream in terms of the way they would think, well, here's what the Indie Next list will do. So like I was at my independent bookstore here in Lexington, just shout out Joseph Beth Booksellers. And there was a brochure on the table or on the counter that had Memoirs of Stockholm, Sven on the cover of it, I believe. And I was just like, well, clearly I'm buying that book. It was like a cover buy, but I hadn't even seen the cover of the book yet. I just saw it on the brochure and was just like, immediately, I've got a thing about like cabins in snow. It's a little bit of a hobby of mine. So as soon as I saw it, I knew I had to own it. And literally like it's my favorite book I've read this year. And it's one of my all-time favorite books. And seriously, it wins the award for like the best cover buy of my life. And yeah, I loved it so much. I'm so excited to talk to you about it and to kind of hear more about its origins and a little bit more about your life and how you came to write it. But before we talk about Sven, yeah, let's hear a little bit about you, like where you're coming from now, what brought you to the farm in Vermont, and what did you do before that led to there?
Sure. So yeah, I live on this farm in central Vermont. I raise beef cattle, and I used to raise pigs as well, but every year I swore I'd never do it again. And I think I finally am holding true to that vow that I really will never have pigs again. But yeah, it's just the cattle and making hay and whatnot. But I'd done since college 100 years ago, approximately, have lived in about 15 different places, done about 45 different jobs, never for very long. I was a journalist for a few years, arts critic, which is an interesting little sort of karmic turn of events to be at the other end of that. And among other things, a lot of ranch work, a lot of menial labor, worked on a beer bottling line in Milwaukee, many things, few of them illustrious, but I knew that after a certain point of years of doing that and having finished grad school, that I needed to work on the land, work outside. It's what I enjoyed most in all of those previous jobs and iterations. and also not have a boss, which is something I'm bad at having, bad at being in that dynamic. And so we looked for land out west. I've been living in the Rocky Mountain West for about 15 years, and looking for land in Western Montana for a long time, which is where we were living, and couldn't find anything right, anything with water on it, anything that wasn't covered in invasive weeds. And my uncle was in Randolph, Vermont, and he did a hard sell, and that's how we ended up here, where we've been for the last 10 years. And I raised sounds like I did it single-handedly. My wife and I had a son here. He's now 9, and a dog simultaneously. He was his brother. And that's our little family unit.
So you mentioned being an arts critic and a reporter or a journalist, I suppose. And at what point did you start writing fiction now?
Well, and I can't remember if we talked about this in our our summit that night, but when I began to think of myself as a writer absurdly in high school or something, I was really aping my influences, as people do at that age, and my number one hero in that time was Haruki Murakami, and the whole sort of school of Japanese surrealism, and that heavily influenced everything I touched and tried to write. And I'd say all of it, in retrospect, bad. This is bad. And so I had to go through this sort of metamorphosis where I left fiction by the wayside for a while. Fortunately, not forever, but I spent a number of years just writing nonfiction, not only the journalism, but a lot of creative nonfiction, personal essay, narrative nonfiction, experiential journalism, that type of thing. And I sort of exhausted my ability after a certain point to see myself so nakedly on the page. And I reached a point, and this is, I did a lot of that in grad school, and it was actually midway through the MFA, and I was there for nonfiction, when I realized I hit the wall, and I no longer wanted to write nonfiction, or very seldomly, and no longer wanted to be in the work in that way. And I switched over to fiction, which caused some ripples within my MFA track, and I wasn't able actually to get in any fiction workshops. It was an interesting time, and I kind of haven't looked back. I've been writing fiction with a little bit of poetry on the side, but pretty much fiction ever since.
What's your favorite Murakami?
I loved The Elephant Vanishes, the collection of short stories, more than any of his novels.
Okay.
That one I read it multiple times, and though there have been others along the way that I connected with, I have a soft spot for Kafka on the Shore. I've tried to revisit some of the ones that I loved in that day, and they don't catch me the way they used to. But tastes change. I do. Yeah, go ahead.
Reading him always, I love Murakami too, but every time I read his books, I always want to cook lunch, because he's always talking about making a simple meal. Yes. And I'm like, oh, I want a simple meal.
Very well said. Yeah, he captures that food. That reminds me also of the movie Tampopo. Have you ever seen that, David?
No.
It's a glorious Japanese movie about the art. I guess it's less simple than the art of, there's a whole thing about the art of the perfect bowl of ramen. And okay. It's a great movie. I really recommend it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I've been watching Tokyo Vice recently. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but yeah.
Not yet. That's a Michael Mann project, right?
Right, it's fantastic. So before we talk about the book, maybe give a brief synopsis.
Sure.
And that's always my least favorite thing, so I hate making you do it. But in case there are participants here who haven't read it yet or are wondering more about it, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it's about?
Okay, be happy to stumble through that. For the most importantly, though it's called The Memoirs of Stockholm, Sven, it is a novel. It's not actually a memoir. He's a fictional character. The character of Sven is based so loosely. I mean, I hesitate to even use the word based, but on a character about whom we know very little, about whom I knew even less when I wrote the thing. He well, in my version, he was a sort of alienated, self-alienating mill worker in Stockholm in the 19-teens who emigrates to Svalbard, or what used to be known as Spitsbergen, the island archipelago about more or less halfway between Norway and the North Pole, and to take a contract as a miner. And the real guy, who was in truth actually a plumber in Stockholm, was very soon after arriving in Svalbard horrendously disfigured in an avalanche, a mining accident, while he was in the mine, and thereafter removed himself to an extremely isolated fjord in the northern part of the archipelago, and spent out the rest of his days hunting and trapping there, as people did in that era, the sort of first half of the 20th century. And it's a place that is about as remote now as it was then. And I guess what I'll say about the book is that, and maybe we can get into this if there's time, but for anyone thinking about, here's my pitch, for anyone thinking about reading it, thinking, oh man, I don't know if I want to read like one man alone against the wilderness, you know, it sounds like a man story. I mean, maybe there's some of that, but this is really a story about his connections, the family that he forges up there, and how he deals with isolation and how he overcomes it in a way. And so it's not, if it has that one man thing, I don't know. In some ways the book is written in opposition to that type of narrative. And I guess that was a really weird summary, but
no, I thought it was great. It was great. And it's accurate too. And one that actually leads into one of the things I was going to say. There's a quote in the book that says, once you begin to think like a walrus, it's difficult to think like a man again. And I think that line is a great sort of like distillation of the idea of this book being a study in solitude. And partly so, like there are small portions of the book where you see Sven like struggling to survive basically just with himself and his dog. And there is another memorable scene with the walrus, but I don't want to give any spoilers there. But what makes the book sing is Sven's surprising relationships, whether it's McIntyre, Tapio, Helga, Skold. Like there are all of these people that come into his life, and almost at every turn, it's not what he would have wanted. He doesn't want those people, but there they are. And then ultimately, as the reader, like as someone who actually came to the book for the like, let's see this man in isolation in the wilderness, I was so surprised in a good way with the layered and relationships and friendships that Sven makes during the course of the story. And I'm wondering if you think those friendships, part of me wonders like if they're actually enhanced by the sort of dimness of the surroundings. So like the fact that they're in a place where it feels very isolating, the fact that they aren't isolated almost makes those it's like putting your friendships in a time capsule, I feel like. Maybe. Do you think that's true? Or
absolutely true. Like anything, whether it's friendship or connection or a strong drink, I mean, it's things that you receive in that time of extreme need, or in a vacuum, have such an increased potency. And I think that's absolutely true for Sven's friends and his family. And also, as you mentioned, the fact that they came to him unbidden. In many ways, Sven is he's the recipient of things in his life. He's not the main actor in his own story. He's not a cipher, but I'd say Sven is someone who thinks of himself always as the least interesting person in the room, but that doesn't mean that he seeks out these connections. He's difficult. That's something I can relate to. He's a little moody, he's a little difficult, and he likes his solitude even before his face is mangled. And I think that having these people, these dogs who sort of congregate around him over time, that influence is heightened by the fact not only that they exist in a place where such things would be difficult, even difficult to attain and unlikely, but also the fact that he doesn't go looking for them.
Yeah, McIntyre is, I feel like he's a character kind of for the ages. He's a sort of Renaissance man in the middle of I was going to say desert, but literally the opposite of that, but a metaphorical desert. I mean, his hut is like a library. It's a place to listen to music, and it kind of gives life, I feel like, to Sven, and then sort of the reader as well as you're reading it. And I don't know if there's a real life McIntyre in your life, or if you were just sort of able to throw all these kind of wonderful characteristics into one character. I mean, I have to think he was really a fun character to write.
Absolutely fun. I mean, in many ways, I think he's the one who stretches credibility the most, in that he's sort of the perfect friend. Not only does he show up at the right time, the crucial time for Sven, and rescue him from what's looking like a pretty steep downward trajectory, but yeah, he's got all these. He's warm, he's welcoming, he's well read, he's got the music, he's got the whiskey, he's got the books. He's
where
just,
you want to be.
Yeah, I certainly, through, as far as the books are concerned, and his wide-ranging intellect and his desire to cultivate Sven's intellect and curiosity, I would have to say that there's a lot of my mother in McIntyre, but he's just, yeah, he's the essential friend for that moment and for life. And I think in this book there's certainly some wish fulfillment in terms of, and I can relate to that. I've lived in some fairly remote places myself, where it's hard to make connections, it's hard to find friendship and anything else. And so there's a sense of like, oh, wouldn't it be nice for Sven, for the reader, for anyone to be in such a remote place, such an isolated place, and have just run headlong into the friend of a lifetime.
Or your mom, apparently.
Or my mom, as the case may be.
That's one cool mom, I have to say. So I want to hear a little bit more about your Arctic adventures, maybe is a better word. So, yeah. And kind of also tell us, if you could tell us about your residency, and then also kind of tell us how that related to the origins of this book.
Right. So having been obsessed with the history of polar exploration from an early age, and again, my mother introduced me to Alfred Lansing's The Endurance when I was preteen, and that started the amassing of a vast quantity of books on the subject, many of them lethally dull. They're behind me, but I've been fascinated with that theme forever, and mostly Edwardian, Georgian, Victorian era exploration, both British and then Swedish and Norwegian. I had been writing on the subject already about the year 2010, coming out of that MFA, and knew I needed to. I'm someone who needs to. You and I have bonded on this subject. I've got to be on the ground in order to write about a place effectively, or otherwise I just can't do it justice. I'm a place-minded writer. I hate to say place-based. It doesn't make any sense to me. But so I knew I needed to get up there. Couldn't afford to get there as a tourist. That wouldn't have really worked anyway for my purposes. Fortunately, found this artist residency called the Arctic Circle. I encourage anyone to look into it if they're curious. It was fantastic. It was about 2.5 weeks aboard a traditionally rigged ship. This was a barkentine, and we motored mostly under diesel power, but kind of made our way around the northwest shoulder of the archipelago over the course of these 2.5 weeks. Every day, most days, you could get out in the Zodiac, make land. It was me. I was the only writer aboard that year. The rest were visual artists, musicians, etc. And they're out there doing their art, and I'm scribbling notes, freezing my fingers off, and taking a lot of photographs. And that was the genesis. And when we were up there, without me having known about Stockholm Sven at all, we landed in Rodfjorden, where a lot of this book takes place, and saw his hut, the hut of the real Stockholm Sven. And looking, I'm sure, about as it did 70 years ago. And up until that point, I'd still, my project proposal for the artist residency and all my plans had been related to polar exploration. I was writing about the old explorers in the bad old days and the scurvy and the frozen ships and whatnot. And up until that day, I still thought I would. And when I walked into this hut, I love themes of isolation. I've written on them a great deal already, and this is like the ultimate isolate. And it just grabbed me, this hut and its closeness, its kind of claustrophobic closeness, and there was some detritus from Sven's days, an old can of honey and some matchbox at a crumbling wood stove, and then outside, measureless fjord. I mean, just a daunting scope, an unknowable scope. And I got home and wrote the first 2 pages of this book, which are no longer the first 2 pages. And then, of course, I sat on it for about 4 years.
As you do.
Yeah.
Well, so, okay, then this kind of leads into my next question too, which is, I have this theory. I lived in Nashville as a musician for years, before my wife and I had because we have a 9-year-old son as well, which is something that we've talked about. We're fairly certain that our kids could be best friends if we lived closer, but I mean, I'm sure they would be, but yeah, so I have this theory that kids, I think a lot of artists and writers and musicians tend to think of having kids as sort of a barrier between yourself and making the art.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly when it comes to scheduling, it can be more complicated, like when you're able to kind of shift around your schedule to find the time to do the thing. But I have a theory that kids are really a boon to creating. Like there's an urgency and sort of I don't want to use the word purpose necessarily, because it's not to say that people without kids are purposeless in their pursuit of art, but there is it shifts into some other kind of zone that I was unprepared for, that really catapulted me into a new sort of venture when it came to seeking out my art. Would you say that that's true as well for you? I mean, have you found pre-kid and post-kid, obviously things change, schedules make it a lot harder, but have you found that there is a little bit more urgency on your part to really create and write and make the thing?
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. I generally tend to attribute the changes in my own writing patterns and philosophies as a sort of development slowly and too late of the prefrontal cortex. And it's just sort of like, okay, I've developed a little more empathy. My writing is a little more humane and human than it was. I'm not sure, but as far as I can absolutely see how becoming a father has influenced not only my preoccupations and what I'm willing to put characters through necessarily, but as you said, a certain urgency to, I don't know, maybe that's also just mortality, but to get things on the page. I wish I could say I acted more under that sense of urgency. I tend to respond to that urgency with just greater inertia at times, but no, it hasn't really proved a barrier the way that I know that it does for people who have rotten schedules or single parents or whatever the case may be. I'm lucky enough that between my wife and me, we have pretty flexible schedules. As a farmer, I kind of set my own, and she is in private practice as a social worker, therapist. So we've always been able to make it work. When my son was born, I was finishing up a different novel, and I can remember sitting at the desk with him just sort of passed out on my leg. You know, it doesn't do wonders for focus, but it can be done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had a similar story in writing my first novel with a baby, and there being this sort of like element of, you know, because you put your characters through the ringer. Like, I mean, as a writer, like you have to do things. And I just remember looking at my literally like 3-week-old kid, just being like, don't you ever, like as I'm writing. But it's yeah, I don't know. I also have like a chronic nostalgia problem, I think. So I end up always saying things in the past as like, those were the days.
Yeah.
I want to talk about chapter endings a little bit. So I'm a big fan of like I'm a big fan of short chat. I write short chapters. I love chapter endings that leave you going, oh, like either you're mad or you're laughing, or you just can't wait to go to the next chapter. But some, like, just for example, my two favorite, and this was just like a play with words that you did there. See, I don't want to do any spoilers, so I won't tell you who banked it. How do you say it? Banked?
Yeah, I think you got it.
Banked. The sentence is, banked was no longer, we would live longer. And I think like the songwriter in me was like, you motherfucker. I love that line. Oh man, it was so good. And then my other favorite was, if indeed God had created the Arctic, he would have stared in amazement and horror at his works, and then off his guard stumbled into a crevasse. I love that, man. It's so great. It's just so good. Do you, I mean, I know this is your first published novel. Do you intentionally write shorter chapters and think about the chapter endings, or is it just something that kind of accidentally happened with this book, or how did that work for you?
Well, I think in some ways it's accidental in the case that it's sort of unconscious, but what's not unconscious is the endings. As far as chapter length goes, I think I tend to keep things sort of punchy because of a journalism background, and as somebody obsessed with words and language, I'm always thinking of the rhythm, the sort of the, sorry about the cliche, but the music of the words as they appear and as they sound. I read everything I write out loud to myself to hear how I'm constantly adjusting the length of sentences and paragraphs. So naturally I'm doing it with chapters as well. But it has to be musical to me. That's why I like writing poetry as well. But there's also a bit of journalism in there, in that when you're writing articles, you have to be punchy, and you want your reader to have, they talk about the pyramid when you're writing for newspapers, in terms of like the lead, and then you're sort of expecting your readers to drop off as they get through and so you're trying to hold on to them, and the ones who get to the end of your article, you know, they're your core people, you've held on to them, so you want to leave them with something like a great quote or something that just really punches. And I try to do that with my chapters as well. It keeps me entertained. I hope it keeps the reader entertained. But yeah, for me, I'm always paying attention to that music. A little bit of repetition goes a long way, like that line about banked. um, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it makes me really happy that you keyed into that.
Well, and I think it's just that I recognized, like, so I've recently kind of come up with this, and I'm sure someone else has thought of it too. It's probably not an original thought, but I call it the hierarchy of values, which is like when you're reading, there are things you look for as a reader in a book, and we all look for different things, which is why some people love a certain book that I hate and vice versa.
Right.
So we each have our own hierarchy of values, and I've become increasingly aware that that hierarchy is applied to my own writing. So I'm drawn to books that have short chapters and longer sentences, and writers who focus on the musicality of language and character deep dives. Like I can forgive like poor pacing. I don't care about the pacing of a book. I just don't. So like that's always, and so it's not a surprise that that's a big struggle for me in my own writing, because I'm like, who cares about pacing? And my editors, well, some people care about pacing. So yeah, but in my hierarchy of values, like you check every box with this book, and so I love the musicality of the language, and I love the characters, and like you said, it's kind of having that punchy payoff at the end of each chapter. Yeah, I loved it. What so does the hierarchy of values hold water for you, you think?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And everything that I read and everything that I write. And unfortunately, you're not always going to be reading things that check all those boxes. But boy, I sure try. And fortunately, I'm willing to abandon ship at almost any stage of a book if it's not hitting enough of those boxes. I do think it's funny that pacing is not one of your boxes. It's clearly not one of mine either. I know writers are not supposed to look at Goodreads reviews and stuff like that. Occasionally I will glance at them, or Amazon or something like that. And my wife's saying, why are you doing that? I send you the good ones. You don't need to look. And invariably, it's like, where was this book going? The pacing
Yeah.
every time.
Who cares? So I'm gonna ask one more question, and then yeah, we have about 10 minutes left. So if anybody has questions, please do throw them in the Q&A box at the bottom here, and I'll get to those after this question. So I saved the best for last. I feel like I can tell when a writer has loved a dog. So I want to know what dog you've loved, and how that dog made its way into this book, or if it did at all.
Oh, yeah. Well, it certainly did. I've loved two dogs more than most. My previous dearly departed life partner, Lalo, is Eberhard. For those of you who read the book, Eberhard is Sven's first dog. Don't worry, he lives a really long time. I don't believe in dogs as plot devices, just to advance the character's development or emotional journey one way or the other. I really long as a reader for dogs to be written as nuanced characters with eccentric personalities, as they have. And in order to do that, in order to bring these two major dogs in the book to life, I just kind of did this crazy like resurrection of my dog Lalo, and giving his personality to Eberhard, not so much his looks, but a little bit. And that was an interesting emotional thing to do, and because it's a full dog's life pretty much, so it includes his death. And that scene, which I hope people won't feel is treated unfairly. I gave my all to it, and put everything in that I felt. So that's a very real scene for me. And then his second dog is based on my current dog, who's now, I can't believe it, almost 10. And he's actually snoring right next to me. You could probably even hear it. But his name is Bonaparte, and he's the model personality-wise for 610, the second major dog.
Well, I thought that I loved both dogs, but Eberhard especially. And I thought that it was, it was such a tribute to their friendship and their relationship, the way you handled all of that. So well done.
Thanks, David. I want to know about this dog you keep sitting, but is not your dog.
So I grew up with a dog who lived to be about 18, and his name was Adidas. And I mean, it was that classic sort of really just true love kind of with a pet. And my wife didn't grow up with any pets, and so having a dog or not having a dog is we never fight about it, but it's an ongoing discussion in our house. And so kind of where we've landed is we dog sit for a good friend of ours who's out of town a lot. So I will occasionally post a picture of us with Levi.
Wow.
Okay, well, so we have a question here. We have two questions. So the first one is, will you return to the same setting in future books, and what are you working on next?
Okay. Well, I wouldn't rule it out. My wife would like me to write a sequel featuring Skuld, who I won't tell you the details of who her character is if you haven't read it yet, but
she's fantastic, by the way.
If I did write another book in this region, it would be about Skuld, probably. I don't know that I will, but I see that follow-up question from somebody else there about is it's relevant to the first question. Will my next book be Nordic based? I certainly would have said no. But because, I was thinking I need to do some research, travel, and I would like to go someplace warm. I live in Vermont, cold for 8 months of the year. Wouldn't it be nice to write about the Dominican Republic or something of that kind? But here I am, a good chunk of the way into a novel about Iceland. So there you have it. I guess you'd call that somewhat Nordic based. And I'm going back there in August, COVID permitting, to do some more research. And it's a modern tale, though, about, well, I guess that's all I'll say for now.
It's weird, like what you can and can't talk about with future stuff. I will say the last time we talked, we were talking about The Last Kingdom, and you mentioned how you read the books, and I just started the first one. I'm pretty well into it. I'm really loving it. I'm a sucker for this. Yeah.
What's that, David?
I'm a sucker for those, like the Dane English, back in the 9th century. Like, what is it about that? I don't know. It's
so good. And Cornwell, I mean, for his faults, he's a formulaic, right? He loves those formulas, as you'll find if you read them. And I won't say anything else, but he, to his credit, he does a ton of research and integrates it very well into his fiction. I mean, he more than others. And so, yeah, I'm a sucker for that time period as well.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm popping back on because I realized I can't submit a question because I'm the host. But I wanted to actually ask you my own question. So I listened to this on audio, and it was a terrific audiobook. And so I was curious how much involvement you have in choosing the narrator. Like, do you get to be involved in that process at all? And have you listened to it?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, Jen. It's one of my favorite subjects. I think I did a weird thing. As a first-time novelist, no, they were not interested in my opinion about who should read it. But what they were going to give me, like a choice of 5 contracted professional audiobook readers. Generally, they're not actors; they're professional readers. I could choose my favorite, that type of thing. But I'm obsessed with audiobooks, and I love a really good reader. And early on, during the publishing process, I became fixated on the prospect, knowing it was seriously unlikely, of one of my favorite actors, the Icelandic actor Olafur Darri Olafsson, reading this book, despite not being Swedish. It doesn't really matter. He's got such an amazing, deep, booming voice, but also so much gravitas and grit and empathy coming out of every pore, I feel. And so I waged this kind of nutty, irrational letter writing campaign to everyone at Little Brown and everyone at Hodder who was doing the audiobooks. Can you please just ask him, and I write these like 20-point, treatises on why he was perfect to do it. And I think eventually they agreed to ask him just to make me shut up about it. And fortunately, he read, he said, sure, I'll read it. And he read it. And he was able to fit it into his schedule. He was filming in Adelaide, Australia, got into a recording booth down there. It's the joy of my life. I'll never get over how happy I am that he read it. And we've since become friends. I've listened to it twice. I mean, it's weird probably to listen to your own book that much, but it's like pure joy for me. He's so perfect for it. And now he's helping me with my next book, with contacts in Iceland and stuff. I'm going to get to meet him there. So everything worked out really well with that. I love the audiobook.
Is he the one in Trapped?
Yes.
Yeah.
He's the one in Trapped. And he's got another great film called The Deep, about a true story about a guy who is shipwrecked off of the Westman Islands and survives an improbably long time in the water. A story of a real guy. It's a great movie.
Well, all right. I'm so glad that I came on and asked that question then. But I mean, if anyone in our audience likes audiobooks, this is, as you heard, I mean, it's a really great version, and I highly recommend it as a way to read this book. And I just recommend the book overall. I mean, I think I said this at the beginning, but I loved it. And I'm so glad you asked the question, David, about the dog, because that's always a red flag, like, uh-oh, there's a dog, we're in the Arctic, this isn't going to go well, I was panicking, and I wasn't sure how I was going to handle it. It's all fine. I loved how you handled the dogs. So
thanks, Jen.
Excellent work. And we are at the end of the time here, so I can't keep gushing and fangirling anymore. So Nathaniel and David, thank you so much. This was a really terrific conversation. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. And I hope everyone is rushing out to get this book right now. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. And Nathaniel, David, terrific. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
See you, Nathaniel.